The piercing sound of a child's cough echoed through the bitter night as Sarah Mitchell clutched her daughter closer, trying to shield her from the cruel winter wind that cut through their threadbare coats. "Please, Margaret," Sarah begged, her voice breaking as she stood at the doorstep of the home that was once hers. "Just until Lily's fever breaks, one more night." But the door slammed shut with such force that the small bundle of possessions at Sarah's feet scattered across the snow-covered porch. Behind her, Thomas stood motionless, his small shoulders squared in a brave attempt to appear strong for his mother and sister, even as tears froze against his cheeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snow had been falling steadily over Pinecrest Valley for 3 days, transforming the once bustling mining town into a desolate landscape of white. Sarah Mitchell had known this day might come, since her husband Robert had succumbed to the mining accident 6 months ago, but nothing could have prepared her for the cruelty of its arrival. "You've had your charity," George Wilson's voice had boomed through the parlor earlier that morning. "Robert's been gone half a year, and we've fed and housed you long enough." His wife Margaret nodded in agreement, her thin lips pressed together in a line of cold determination. "This house belongs to the Wilson family now. You were never truly part of it." The words had sliced through Sarah more painfully than the winter wind that now whipped around her as she trudged through knee-deep snow, one arm supporting Lily, who burned with fever despite the freezing temperatures, the other hand clutching Thomas's frozen fingers. Each step away from the only security they'd known felt like stepping into an abyss. Thomas hadn't spoken a word since they'd been forced out, his usual cheerful chatter silenced by the shock of seeing his grandmother, the woman who'd once slipped him peppermint candies when no one was looking, slide the bolt home without a backward glance. Now he simply walked, his father's too large hat pulled down over his ears, occasionally glancing up at his mother with eyes that held too much understanding for a child of 9. Lily's cough had worsened over the past week, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from somewhere terrifyingly deep in her tiny chest. The town doctor had shaken his head when Sarah had brought her in, muttering about miner's lung, despite Lily never having set foot in the mines. "Keep her warm," he'd advised, as if warmth were something Sarah could conjure from the air. "Try honey and whiskey for the cough if you can get it." But there would be no honey or whiskey tonight. There would be no warm hearth or soft bed. There was only the brutal reality of 3 souls cast out into the Montana winter with nowhere to turn. "The Johnsons might take us in," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Thomas, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. But even as she said it, she knew it was unlikely. The town had sides, and most had chosen the Wilsons after Robert's death. The wealthy mine owners had spread whispers that Sarah had been careless with money, that she'd somehow brought bad luck on her husband, that she wasn't fit to raise children alone. The main street of Pinecrest Valley was growing dim as shopkeepers shuttered their windows against the approaching night. A few faces peered out at the trio as they passed, but doors remained firmly closed. No offers of shelter came. Sarah felt the weight of those watching eyes, the judgment, the relief that it wasn't them trudging through snow with 2 children and nowhere to go. "Mama," Thomas finally spoke, his voice small against the howling wind. "Where are we going?" Sarah swallowed, the lump in her throat. She'd always promised herself she would never lie to her children. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but we'll find somewhere." The uncertainty in her voice betrayed her, and Thomas's grip on her hand tightened. They had reached the edge of town, now where the neatly arranged buildings gave way to scattered homesteads and eventually the looming darkness of the pine forest. Sarah hesitated at this threshold. The forest was dangerous, everyone knew that. Wolves, bears, the treacherous terrain. But the town behind them offered no refuge, and at least the dense pines might provide some shelter from the wind. "The old ranger station," Thomas said suddenly, pointing toward the tree line. "Pa took me there once. It's not far." Sarah stared at her son, a flicker of hope kindling in her chest. The ranger station had been abandoned years ago when the new one was built closer to town. It might still be standing, might still have walls and a roof. It was better than nothing. "Show me," she said, shifting Lily in her arms. The little girl's breath came in short, labored gasps, her skin burning against Sarah's neck. The forest swallowed them into its shadowy embrace as they left the last lantern of Pinecrest Valley behind. The snow was less deep here, caught in the branches of the towering pines above, but the darkness was absolute. Thomas led with surprising confidence, following some path remembered from happier days with his father. Time lost meaning as they pushed forward, the cold seeping through Sarah's thin boots until she could no longer feel her toes. Lily had grown worryingly quiet, and Thomas's steps had slowed, his initial determination flagging as exhaustion set in. Just as Sarah felt her own resolve beginning to crumble, the trees thinned and a small clearing appeared. The ranger station stood like a spectre in the gloom, a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch and shuttered windows. It was smaller than Sarah had imagined and clearly abandoned for years, but it was standing. It was shelter. "You did it, Thomas," she whispered, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "You found it!" The door protested loudly as Sarah pushed it open, the hinges stiff with disuse. Inside was pitch black and smelled of dust and animal droppings, but it was dry and out of the wind. Thomas fumbled in their small bundle of possessions and produced a single precious match, one of 3 they had left. The match flared to life, illuminating the station's single room. A table lay overturned in one corner, 2 of its legs missing. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, filled with old ashes and what looked like a bird's nest. The floor was littered with broken glass and debris, but it was solid beneath their feet. "Hold Lily," Sarah instructed, passing her daughter to Thomas's waiting arms. The boy staggered slightly under his sister's weight, but held firm as Sarah set about assessing their shelter. The match burned dangerously close to her fingers before she used it to light a small pile of dry leaves and twigs she'd gathered from a corner. The flame was weak, but it provided enough light to work by. The fireplace was their first priority. Sarah cleared the debris with numb hands, searching for anything that might burn. An old wooden chair, broken beyond repair, would provide fuel, as would some shelving that had partially collapsed. She worked methodically, refusing to acknowledge the panic that threatened to overwhelm her each time Lily's breathing hitched or a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the station's thin walls. It took the last 2 matches and all of Sarah's determination, but eventually a small fire sputtered to life in the grate. It wasn't much. They'd need more wood before the night was through, but the dancing flames cast a warm glow over the children's faces as they huddled close. "You should eat something," Sarah said, reaching for their meager supplies. Half a loaf of bread, rock hard from the cold, a small jar of preserves she'd hidden in her pocket, a handful of dried apples saved from better days. She divided the food carefully, giving each child a portion that looked bigger than her own. Thomas ate silently, his eyes never leaving the fire. Lily merely turned her head away, her fever-bright eyes dull with exhaustion. Sarah managed to coax a few spoonfuls of preserve into her daughter before the little girl fell into a fitful sleep. As the night deepened, the wind rose to a howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The old station creaked and groaned under its assault, and the fire dwindled despite Sarah's careful tending. She had used the last of the broken furniture, and venturing into the forest for more wood in the darkness was unthinkable. Thomas had finally succumbed to sleep, curled protectively around his sister on a bed made from Sarah's shawl spread over a relatively clean section of floor. Sarah sat beside them, back against the wall, keeping watch as the fire died to embers. In the growing darkness, the reality of their situation pressed down on her with suffocating weight. They couldn't stay here long. The station had no food, no provisions of any kind. Lily needed medicine, proper care. They all needed warmth that this drafty shelter couldn't provide. But where could they go? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The nearest town was Rivers Bend, at least 3 days' walk in good weather. In this snow with a sick child? Impossible. A sound outside froze Sarah's blood in her veins. Something was moving around the station, its footfalls heavy enough to be heard even over the wind. Not a small animal, something large. Her hand closed around a piece of firewood, the only weapon she had. The door latch rattled. Sarah rose to her feet, placing herself between the door and her sleeping children, the makeshift club raised and ready. The door swung open with a groan of protest, and there, silhouetted against the night, stood the largest man Sarah had ever seen. He filled the doorway completely, shoulders broad beneath layers of fur and leather, face obscured by a wild beard crusted with ice. For a long moment, he remained motionless, as if taking in the scene before him. Sarah didn't lower her improvised weapon, though her arms trembled with the effort of holding it aloft. "This is private property," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're just sheltering for the night. We'll be gone by morning." The stranger made no reply. His eyes, the only feature clearly visible in the dim light, moved from Sarah to the children huddled by the dying fire, lingering on Lily's small form. Then, without a word, he stepped back outside, pulling the door closed behind him. Sarah remained frozen in place, straining to hear movement over the howling wind. Was he leaving? Circling the building to find another way in? Should she wake? Thomas tried to escape, but before she could decide, the door opened again. The man returned, but this time his arms were laden with firewood. Without acknowledging Sarah, he moved to the fireplace and began methodically rebuilding the fire, his movements practiced and efficient. Soon, flames leapt higher than before, bathing the room in welcome warmth and light. Still silent, the stranger shrugged off his heavy outer coat and hung it near the fire. Beneath it, he wore simple but sturdy clothing, a wool shirt, leather, a vest, trousers worn smooth at the knees. A knife hung at his belt, its handle well used but clean. He was younger than Sarah had first thought, perhaps 40, with streaks of grey in his dark hair and beard. "The girl is sick," he finally spoke, his voice rough, as if unused to conversation. It wasn't a question. Sarah lowered her makeshift club but kept it close. "Yes, she has a fever and a cough that won't break." The man nodded once, then reached into a leather satchel Sarah hadn't noticed before. He withdrew a small tin and a flask, setting both on the floor near the fire. "Willow bark tea," he said, nodding at the tin. "For the fever, the flask is honeyed whiskey for the cough." Sarah stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate hope. "Why would you help us?" The man's gaze returned to the fire, his expression unreadable. "No one should die of cold, especially not a child." He offered no name, asked for none in return. Instead, he settled himself on the far side of the fire, back against the wall, legs stretched toward the warmth. His eyes closed, but Sarah sensed he wasn't sleeping, merely giving her space to decide. She approached the tin cautiously, removing the lid to find dried bark shavings inside. The remedy was common enough. Her own mother had used it for fevers. The flask she opened and sniffed carefully. Honey and whiskey as promised, nothing more. Lily stirred as Sarah gently woke her. The little girl's eyes were glassy with fever, her cheeks flushed an unnatural red. "Drink this, sweetheart." Sarah, uncoaxed, having steeped the willow bark in hot water from the flask. "It will make you feel better." Lily managed a few small sips before turning her head away, but even that small amount seemed to ease her labored breathing. The honeyed whiskey she accepted more readily, its sweetness overcoming the bite of alcohol. Across the fire, the stranger watched through half-lidded eyes. Sarah met his gaze over her daughter's head. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, then closed his eyes completely. The storm raged through the night, but the fire never dimmed again. Whenever it threatened to, the stranger would silently add another log from his seemingly endless supply. By morning, Lily's fever had broken, and the incessant cough had eased to occasional spasms. Sarah had dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, but the stranger hadn't moved from his position against the wall. As dawn's grey light filtered through the station's dirty windows, he rose in a fluid motion that belied his size and moved to the door. "Wait!" Sarah called, scrambling to her feet. "Who are you?" The man paused, his hand on the latch. "Ethan Blackwood." He seemed to consider saying more, then simply added, "I'll return at sundown with food." Before Sarah could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Thomas, who had awakened during the exchange, stared wide-eyed at the space where the stranger had been. "Is he coming back, Ma?" he asked, a note of hope in his voice that Sarah hadn't heard since before they'd been cast out. "He said he would," Sarah replied, surprised to find she believed it. There had been something solid about Ethan Blackwood, something trustworthy despite his rough appearance and few words. The day passed slowly. Sarah ventured outside only long enough to gather more snow to melt for drinking water. The storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white stretching in every direction. If there was a path Ethan had followed to reach them, it was now buried beneath feet of fresh snow. Inside, Sarah did what she could to make the station more habitable. She cleared debris, swept dirt from the floor with a branch of pine needles, and arranged their few possessions neatly in one corner. Thomas helped, seemingly energized by the presence of a task, while Lily sat wrapped in Sarah's shawl near the fire, sipping willow bark tea whenever her mother insisted. As the light began to fade, Sarah found herself glancing more frequently at the door. What if he didn't return? What if the promised food didn't materialize? They had finished the last of their bread at midday, and the thought of another night with empty stomachs made her stomach clench with worry. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the sound of footsteps crunching through snow announced Ethan's return. This time, he carried not only more firewood but a burlap sack slung over one shoulder. The scent that wafted from it when he set it down made Sarah's mouth water involuntarily. Inside was a feast by their current standards. A cloth-wrapped package of smoked venison, a small sack of dried berries, 3 potatoes, a chunk of hard cheese, and most surprising of all, a jar of honey. "For the girl's cough," Ethan said, noticing Sarah's gaze on the honey. "Mix it with hot water." He had brought a pot as well, which he set directly in the coals after filling it with clean snow. While they waited for it to melt and heat, Ethan busied himself reinforcing the station's door, plugging gaps in the walls with moss and mud, and fashioning a makeshift bed from pine boughs covered with a bearskin he'd apparently carried rolled up on his back. "For the children," he said, when Sarah protested that he had already done too much. Cold ground steals warmth faster than cold air. That night, they ate better than they had in months. Even Lily managed a few bites of venison and sipped honey water without complaint. Thomas watched Ethan's every move with undisguised fascination, especially when the mountain man used his knife to whittle a small wooden figure, a bear standing on its hind legs, which he presented to the boy without ceremony. "Did you make this cabin?" Thomas asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen over the group. "This isn't a cabin," Ethan replied, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "It's barely a shelter." "Do you have a cabin?" Thomas persisted, undeterred by the man's laconic response. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Ethan's eyes. "I do. Is it far?" Ethan considered the question, as he seemed to consider all questions, with deliberate care. "A day's walk, less in good weather." Sarah looked up from where she was tending to Lily. "You live in these mountains alone?" "Yes." A pause, then almost reluctantly he added, "Since the war." The war had ended 15 years ago. Sarah tried to imagine 15 years of solitude in these wilderness mountains and couldn't. What would drive a man to such isolation? What had he seen that made the company of trees preferable to people? As if reading her thoughts, Ethan turned his attention back to the fire. The ranger station won't last another storm. Roofs compromised. On the north side. Sarah's heart sank. Another storm was inevitable. Winter in Pinecrest Valley meant one blizzard after another until spring finally broke winter's hold. "We'll move on tomorrow," she said, though she had no idea where they would go. "Thank you for your kindness." Ethan regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You have nowhere to go." It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't pretend it was. "No." He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "My cabin has room. The girl needs proper shelter to recover." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and life-altering. Sarah stared at him, searching for any hint of deception or ill intent, but found only the same steady gaze that had watched over them through the night. "Why would you do that?" she asked, the question barely above a whisper. "Take in strangers." Ethan's eyes shifted to the children, Thomas now drowsing over his wooden bear, Lily sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Then back to Sarah. "I was a doctor," he said simply. "Before. Before the war," he meant. Before whatever had driven him to these mountains. Before solitude had become his companion. "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I'm just a man who doesn't want to see children suffer." He rose, stretching his tall frame. "Think on it. I'll return tomorrow." And with that, he was gone again, leaving Sarah with a decision that could change everything. True to his word, Ethan returned the following morning as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. He brought with him a small sled, fashioned from pine branches, lashed together, with leather straps. "For the girl," he explained, seeing Sarah's questioning look, "and your belongings." Sarah had spent a restless night weighing the stranger's offer against the alternatives. Stay in the dilapidated ranger station until they froze or starved. Try to reach River's Bend through miles of snow-choked wilderness. Return to Pinecrest Valley to beg for mercy from those who had already turned their backs once. When presented that way, following a taciturn mountain man to his remote cabin seemed almost reasonable. Almost. "How do I know we'll be safe with you?" she asked bluntly, as Ethan arranged the bearskin on the sled. He paused, considering her question with the same gravity he seemed to give every inquiry. "You don't," he finally said. "But you've trusted me this far." It wasn't the reassurance she'd hoped for, but there was something honest in his acknowledgement that made Sarah more inclined to trust him, not less. He wasn't trying to convince her with sweet words or false promises. "What happens when Lily recovers?" she pressed. "What do you expect in return for your help?" Ethan's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps surprise, perhaps something else. "Nothing. When spring comes, if you wish to leave, I'll guide you to River's Bend." Spring was months away. The thought of spending a winter dependent on this stranger's charity made Sarah's pride bristle, but one look at Lily's pale face was enough to silence those concerns. Her children's lives were worth more than her pride. "We'll come," she decided, "but I want to contribute. I can cook, sew, keep house. I'm not looking for charity." Ethan nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing less. "Pack your things. We leave within the hour." The journey to Ethan's cabin was arduous, despite his careful preparation. The snow was deep, and the terrain grew increasingly steep as they left the valley floor behind. Lily rode on the sled, bundled in the bearskin and Sarah's shawl, looking small and fragile against the vast whiteness surrounding them. Thomas trudged beside Ethan, attempting to place his feet in the larger man's footprints, his face set in determination despite his obvious fatigue. Sarah pulled the sled, the leather harness Ethan had fashioned digging into her shoulders. He had offered to pull it himself, but something in Sarah had refused. This was her child, her responsibility. She would not give that up so easily, even as her muscles screamed in protest, and her breath came in painful gasps in the thin mountain air. They stopped at midday in the shelter of a massive pine, its branches creating a small haven relatively free of snow. Ethan built a fire with practiced efficiency, melting snow for tea and slicing venison for them to eat. Sarah noticed he took no more than a few bites himself, ensuring the children had their fill first. "You were a doctor," she said, watching as he examined Lily's chest with gentle hands, listening to her breathing. "In the war?" Ethan nodded without looking up. "Union Army, field surgeon. And after?" His hands stilled for a moment. "Chicago, for a time." He offered no more, and Sarah didn't press. Everyone had stories they preferred not to tell. God knew she had her own. They resumed their journey as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. The forest grew denser, the pines taller, crowding together as if huddling against the cold. Several times Sarah thought they must have lost their way. There was no path, no markers she could discern, but Ethan moved with the confidence of someone navigating familiar territory. Just as the light was fading and Sarah's strength was nearly spent, the trees opened into a small clearing. There, nestled against the side of the mountain as if it had grown from the rock itself, stood Ethan's cabin. It was larger than Sarah had expected, its walls made of massive pine logs chinked with moss and clay. A stone chimney rose from the center of the sharply pitched roof, thin smoke curling from its top. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, stacked with neatly split firewood and what appeared to be animal pelts stretched on frames to cure. "It's not much," Ethan said, misreading her silence for disappointment. "But it's solid. Keeps the cold out. It's..." Sarah searched for the right word. "Impressive" was what came to mind, but she settled on "perfect. Thank you." Something close to a smile flickered across Ethan's face before he turned away, moving to lift Lily gently from the sled. "Let's get you inside before dark." The interior of the cabin was a single large room with a loft above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cook stove the other. Between them stood a rough-hewn table with 3 chairs, shelves lined with jars and tins, and a curtained area that Sarah guessed concealed a bed. Pelts covered the plank floor, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a pleasant medicinal scent. "You'll sleep there," Ethan said, nodding toward the curtained area as he carried Lily to a rocking chair near the fire. "I'll take the loft." Sarah wanted to protest. It was his home, his bed, but exhaustion weighed her down like a physical thing. All she could manage was a grateful nod as she helped Thomas remove his snow-encrusted boots. That first evening passed in a blur of warmth and unexpected comfort. Ethan prepared a simple stew from venison and root vegetables stored in a root cellar beneath the cabin. He showed Thomas how to tend the fire, explaining the different types of wood and how they burned. For Lily, he brewed a tea from herbs she didn't recognize, sweetened with honey. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sniffing the steaming cup before offering it to her daughter. "Mullein and thyme," Ethan replied, "for her lungs, a little yarrow for the fever." He hesitated, then added, "My mother's remedy." It was the first personal detail he had volunteered, and Sarah sensed it was significant somehow. Was she a healer? Ethan's expression softened slightly. In her way, she knew plants, knew their purposes. That night, as Sarah lay in Ethan's bed, the first real bed she'd slept in since leaving the Wilsons, with her children curled against her, she listened to the sounds of the cabin settling. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Above, in the loft, Ethan's breathing was deep and even. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, she felt safe. The days began to blend together in the quiet rhythm of life at Ethan's cabin. Each morning, Sarah woke to find the fire already stoked, a pot of water heating on the stove, and Ethan gone, out checking traps or hunting, she presumed. She would prepare breakfast for the children from the seemingly endless stores of food in the root cellar, marveling at the careful preparation that had gone into ensuring survival through the harsh mountain winter. Lily grew stronger with each passing day. The persistent cough that had rattled her small frame gradually subsided, replaced by the return of her natural energy. Soon, she was exploring every corner of the cabin, examining Ethan's collection of books with curious fingers, watching wide-eyed as he skinned rabbits or mended tools. Thomas had appointed himself Ethan's unofficial apprentice, following the mountain man wherever he was permitted, absorbing every scrap of knowledge offered with solemn attention. Ethan, for his part, seemed neither annoyed nor particularly pleased by the boy's constant companionship, but Sarah noticed he always took care to explain what he was doing, whether it was setting a snare or identifying animal tracks in the snow. For her part, Sarah threw herself into the work of the cabin. She swept floors, washed linens in melted snow, learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove, and mended clothing with neat, precise stitches. It was her way of maintaining dignity, of ensuring that their presence wasn't merely a burden to be borne. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after their arrival, Sarah found herself alone with Ethan by the fire. The children had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a day spent helping build a snowman near the cabin's entrance. "You don't need to work so hard," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. He was whittling. Another wooden figure, a wolf this time, its form gradually emerging from the block of pine under his skilled hands. Sarah looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of Ethan's, its sleeve torn during a hunting expedition. "I don't mind. It's the least I can do." Ethan's knife paused mid-stroke. "It's not payment I'm looking for." "Then what?" The question had been simmering beneath the surface for days. Why take us in? Why risk your solitude for 3 strangers? The fire crackled in the grate, filling the silence that followed. Ethan resumed his carving, each movement precise and controlled. "After the war," he finally said, his voice low, "I had a family in Chicago, a wife, a daughter." His hands stilled again. Scarlet fever took them both in 75. Sarah's breath caught. "I'm sorry." Ethan acknowledged her sympathy with the slightest nod. "I couldn't save them. Not with all my medical training. Not with all the modern advancements. I watched them slip away, and I could do nothing." His jaw tightened. "After that, I couldn't bear to practice medicine anymore. Couldn't bear to look into the eyes of another parent whose child I couldn't save." "So you came here," Sarah supplied softly, "to be alone." "To punish myself," he corrected, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "At first, then eventually just to exist." to forget. Sarah set her mending aside, suddenly understanding the weight this man carried. And then we arrived. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And then you arrived. A woman and 2 children. One of them sick, all of them in need of help I wasn't sure I could provide. But you did, Sarah said. You saved Lily. Perhaps, Ethan allowed, or perhaps she would have recovered regardless. The point is, I couldn't not try. He looked down at the half-carved wolf in his hands. I couldn't walk away, not again. The revelation settled between them, reshaping Sarah's understanding of this solitary man. Not a hermit by nature, but a doctor driven to isolation by loss. Not cold, but cautious, afraid to care too deeply for fear of failing again. Thank you, she said simply, for not walking away. Ethan met her gaze once more, something unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded and returned to his carving, the silence that followed no longer merely comfortable but somehow shared. The next morning after breakfast, Ethan announced they needed to visit his traps on the far side of the ridge. All of us? Sarah asked, surprised. Until now, he had always gone alone or occasionally with Thomas. Storm's coming, Ethan replied, glancing at the window where ominous clouds were gathering on the horizon. Big one. We'll need extra meat to see us through. More hands make quicker work. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic, but uneasy all the same. She'd grown accustomed to the safety of the cabin, the predictable rhythms of their days. The thought of venturing into the wilderness with a storm approaching sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. We'll bundle up, she said, more to herself than to Ethan. Make sure Lily stays warm. They set out an hour later, the children, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, Ethan leading the way with a weathered pack on his back. The sky had grown darker, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Their breath formed clouds before them as they trudged up the slope behind the cabin, following a narrow path, barely visible beneath the snow. Lily rode on Ethan's shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair for balance. She'd taken to him completely, without the wariness Sarah still sometimes felt. Children, Sarah thought, were better judges of character than adults in many ways. They hadn't yet learned to distrust kindness or look for hidden motives. The trail grew steeper as they ascended, winding between massive boulders and gnarled pines bent by constant wind. Thomas kept pace admirably, his face set in determination despite the difficulty of the climb. He had grown stronger in their weeks at the cabin, the regular meals and physical activity adding muscle to his once thin frame. Not much further, Ethan called back as they reached a particularly steep section. He held out a hand to Sarah, who hesitated only briefly before accepting his assistance. His grip was warm and solid, anchoring her as she navigated the icy path. They crested the ridge just as the first snowflakes began to fall, fat, lazy flakes that drifted down from the leaden sky. From this vantage point, Sarah could see for miles the endless expanse of pine forest below, the distant peaks of higher mountains, and far to the south, a thin ribbon of smoke that might have been Pinecrest Valley. It was breathtaking and terrifying all at once, a stark reminder of their isolation. The traps are this way, Ethan said, setting Lily down carefully on a relatively flat section of ground. Stay close. The weather can change quickly up here. They followed a game trail along the ridgeline, the snow beginning to fall more heavily around them. Ethan checked 5 traps in quick succession, finding 4 empty and 1 containing a snow hare, which he dispatched quickly and added to his pack. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he surveyed the darkening sky. We need to head back, he said, securing the pack. Storm's moving faster than I expected. They had just started back along the trail when a sound froze them in place. A low, rumbling growl from somewhere in the trees to their right. Ethan's hand went instantly to his knife, his body shifting subtly to place himself between the sound and the others. "What is it?" Thomas whispered, eyes wide. "Mountain lion," Ethan replied, his voice calm but tense. "Probably hungry. Game gets scarce this time of year." Sarah pulled Lily close, feeling the child tremble against her. "What do we do?" "Walk, don't run," Ethan instructed quietly. "Stay together, I'll lead. Thomas, you follow, then Sarah and Lily." They began to move slowly down the trail, the hair on the back of Sarah's neck standing on end. She could feel eyes watching them from the shadow of the trees, tracking their movement with predatory focus. Lily whimpered softly, and Sarah tightened her grip on the child's hand. "It's all right," she whispered. "Ethan won't let anything happen to us." The words were meant to reassure Lily, but Sarah realized as she spoke them that she believed them completely. In the weeks they'd spent under his roof, Ethan Blackwood had proven himself worthy of their trust in 100 small ways. They had almost reached the steepest part of the descent when the attack came, a tawny blur of muscle and fury launching from a rocky outcropping above the trail. Ethan shouted a warning, shoving Thomas roughly behind him as he faced the descending predator. What followed happened so quickly that Sarah would later struggle to recall the sequence of events. The mountain lion collided with Ethan, its weight driving him backward. His knife flashed in the dim light as he fought to keep the animal's snapping jaws from his throat. They tumbled together down the slope in a chaotic tangle of limbs and snarls, disappearing from view behind a stand of pines. "Ethan!" Thomas screamed, starting forward only to be yanked back by Sarah. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. "Watch Lily." She forced her trembling hands to remove her outer coat, wrapping it around both children. "Don't move from this spot. Promise me." Thomas nodded, his face pale with fear but his jaw set. He pulled Lily close, shielding her eyes from whatever might happen next. Sarah scrambled down the treacherous slope, her heart hammering against her ribs. The snow was falling heavily now, reducing visibility to mere yards. She followed the disturbed snow and broken branches left by Ethan and the mountain lion's descent, slipping and sliding in her haste. She found them in a small clearing, Ethan on his back, the mountain lion's massive paw pinning his knife arm. To the ground. Blood stained the snow beneath them. Whose? Sarah couldn't tell. Without thinking, she grabbed a fallen branch and charged forward with a cry that startled even herself. The mountain lion turned its head at the sound, momentarily. Distracted. It was enough. Ethan drove his knife upward with his free hand, finding the vital spot beneath the animal's jaw. The big cat screamed, a sound Sarah knew would haunt her dreams, then collapsed atop Ethan, its massive body suddenly limp. With strength born of desperation, Sarah helped push the dead animal aside. Ethan lay motionless for a terrifying moment before his eyes fluttered open, finding hers immediately. "The children!" he gasped. "Safe," Sarah assured him, hands moving frantically over his body in search of wounds. "On the trail, where you told us to stay. Are you hurt?" "Where are you hurt?" Ethan grimaced as he sat up, revealing 4 deep gashes. Across his left shoulder, where the mountain lion's claws had found purchase. "Not as bad as it looks," he said, though the pallor of his face belied his words. "Help me up. We need to get back to the cabin before this storm worsens." Sarah tore strips from her shirt to bind the wounds temporarily, working quickly as the snow continued to fall around them. Ethan's breathing was labored but steady, his movements pained but determined as she helped him to his feet. "You shouldn't have followed," he said, as they began the slow climb back to where the children waited. "Could have been 2 of us dead." "You would have done the same for any of us," Sarah replied simply. Ethan didn't contradict her. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of stumbling progress through increasingly heavy snow. Ethan insisted on carrying Lily despite his injuries, leaving Sarah and Thomas to navigate the treacherous path ahead of him. By the time the cabin came into view, all 4 were exhausted, chilled to the bone, and nearly snowblind. Inside, Sarah moved with desperate efficiency, building up the fire, heating water, preparing the medicinal herbs Ethan directed her to. His wounds needed cleaning and stitching, tasks he tried to instruct her to perform. "I can't," she protested, hands shaking as she looked at the angry gashes in his flesh. "I've never—" "You can," Ethan insisted, his voice weaker than she'd ever heard it. "You must. The children need you whole." The children. Sarah glanced at Thomas and Lily, huddled together on the bearskin rug before the fire, their eyes wide with fear. They had already lost one parent. The thought of them losing, the closest thing to security they'd found since Robert's death, steeled her resolve. "Tell me what to do," she said. Under Ethan's pained but precise instruction, Sarah cleaned the wounds with boiled water and a tincture of yarrow, then threaded a bone needle with catgut. Her hands trembled as she made the first stitch, but steadied as she continued, her focus narrowing to the task before her. 27 stitches later, she tied off the final knot and sat back, exhausted and blood-spattered but triumphant. "You'd have made a fine surgeon," Ethan murmured, his voice slurring slightly from the pain and the willow bark tea she'd given him. "Let's hope I never have to prove that again," Sarah replied, helping him to lie back on the bed. Her bed, these. Past weeks, but now returned to its rightful owner. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them inside the cabin in a cocoon of howling wind and driving snow. Ethan's fever rose and fell as his body fought the infection that set in, despite Sarah's careful cleaning. She barely slept, sitting beside him through the long nights, changing poultices and spooning broth between his cracked lips. The children helped as they could, Thomas keeping the fire stoked, Lily sorting herbs under Sarah's direction. They moved through the cabin with unusual quiet, their young faces solemn with understanding of how precarious their situation had become. On the 4th morning, Sarah woke with a start, realizing she had fallen asleep in the chair beside Ethan's bed. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small windows, bright and clear. The storm had finally broken, and Ethan was watching her, his eyes clear of fever for the first time in days. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough but stronger than it had been. Sarah straightened, brushing hair from her face self-consciously. "Of course I stayed. How could I not?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Most would have run, taken the children, and sought help elsewhere." "In a blizzard with mountain lions roaming about?" Sarah shook her head. "Besides, there was nowhere else to go." "There's always a choice," Ethan said quietly. "You chose to stay, to try." The words hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the immediate circumstance. Sarah looked away, suddenly overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "You would have done the same," she said again, echoing her words from the mountainside. "Yes," Ethan agreed, "I would have." As winter deepened, the rhythm of their days shifted to accommodate Ethan's recovery. At first, he chafed against the limitations of his healing body, frustrated by his inability to hunt or chop wood. But gradually, he found new ways to contribute, teaching Thomas to read from the small collection of books on his shelves, showing Lily how to identify the herbs hanging from the rafters, instructing Sarah in the preparation of remedies for common ailments. For her part, Sarah discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to check the nearby traps, to skin and butcher the small game they provided, to distinguish between animal tracks in the snow. Each new skill was a victory, a step further from the helpless widow who had been cast out into the cold. The winter solstice came and went, marked by a simple celebration. Ethan produced a small cache of dried apples and cinnamon, and Sarah baked a pie in the wood stove. They fashioned gifts from what was available. Ethan carved a set of wooden animals for Lily, showed Thomas how to make a slingshot from a forked branch, and presented Sarah with a comb fashioned from deer antler, polished to a soft sheen. Sarah had nothing to give in return, save a new shirt she had sewn from fabric unraveled from her increasingly tattered petticoat. But Ethan's face when he unwrapped it, the quiet appreciation in his eyes, made her fingers' soreness from countless tiny stitches in dim light worthwhile. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in the loft that had become their domain, Sarah and Ethan sat before the fire as had become their custom. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that had grown during their weeks of shared survival. "Spring will come eventually," Ethan said, breaking the quiet. "The path to River's Bend will clear." Sarah's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. She had known this conversation would come, had felt it approaching like a distant storm. "Yes," she agreed cautiously. Ethan's gaze remained on the fire. "You'll have choices then, places to go, people to see. Do you want us to leave?" The question was direct, perhaps more direct than propriety allowed, but Sarah had learned that Ethan valued honesty above all else. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost uncertain, a tone she had never heard from him before. "I have no right to ask you to stay." "That's not what I asked," Sarah pressed gently. Ethan finally looked at her, his expression as open and vulnerable as she had ever seen it. "No, I don't want you to leave." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Sarah set her mending aside and moved to sit beside him on the bench near the fire. "When Robert died," she began, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "I thought my life was over. The future I had imagined, growing old together, watching our children grow up, sharing grandchildren someday, it all disappeared in an instant." Ethan remained silent, but his hand found hers in the space between them, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with gentle pressure. "I never thought I would find." Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. Peace, purpose, the possibility of happiness again. "Have you?" Ethan asked quietly. "Found those things?" Sarah looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he almost smiled, the streak of silver in his dark beard, the quiet strength in his gaze. "I'm beginning to," she admitted. "Here, with you." It was not a declaration of love. Both were too cautious, too marked by past sorrows for such grand pronouncements. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of possibility, and for now that was enough. For the first time since she had known him, Ethan Blackwood smiled fully, a transformation that took years from his weathered face and lightened the shadows in his eyes. His hand tightened around hers, and Sarah felt something shift within her. Chest, like ice breaking apart in spring thaw. The remainder of winter passed with surprising swiftness. January gave way to February, bringing longer days and occasional thaws that hinted at the coming change of seasons. Ethan's strength returned gradually. By mid-February, he was able to accompany Thomas on short hunting expeditions, though Sarah noticed he favored his injured shoulder and tired more quickly than before. Lily bloomed in the mountain air, her cough completely gone, her cheeks rosy with health. She had appointed herself keeper of the herb stores, carefully sorting and labeling jars under Ethan's patient guidance. More than once, Sarah caught him, watching the little girl with an expression of such tender sadness that her heart ached for the child he had lost years ago. One evening in late February, as a gentle snow fell outside the cabin windows, Ethan cleared his throat during their after-dinner reading session, a ritual that had evolved naturally as the winter progressed. "I've been thinking," he began, setting aside the dog-eared copy of Robinson Crusoe they'd been sharing. "The garden behind the cabin needs tending in spring. It's been years since I've grown more than the basic medicinal herbs." Thomas looked. Up from the checker game he was playing with Lily on the floor. What would you grow? Vegetables, mostly. Potatoes, carrots, maybe some squash. Ethan's gaze shifted to Sarah. If there were more mouths to feed, it would make sense to expand it, build a proper fence to keep the deer out. Sarah understood what he was really saying. This was his way of suggesting a future, one that included all of them. That sounds practical, she replied carefully. A good investment of time and effort. The cabin could use improvements too, Ethan continued, encouraged by her response. Another room, perhaps. More space. For what? Lily asked, looking up from the checkerboard with innocent curiosity. Ethan's eyes never left Sarah's face. For a family that might choose to stay. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Not a widow and her children, sheltering temporarily with a reclusive mountain man, but a family, a unit, a future built together. Would that be something you'd want? Sarah asked, conscious of the children's attention now focused entirely on the conversation. A family? I had one once, Ethan said softly. I never thought I'd want another after... He broke off, glancing at the children. But I was wrong. This winter has taught me that. Thomas moved to stand beside his mother, his young face serious beyond his years. We could help with the garden and building the new room. I'm strong now. Yes, you are, Ethan agreed, his expression softening as he looked at the boy. You've become quite the mountain man yourself. Does this mean we're staying? Lily asked, climbing into Sarah's lap. Forever? Sarah smoothed her daughter's golden curls, buying time as she considered the question. The practical side of her mind listed all the reasons they should return to civilization in spring. The children's education, the isolation, the harsh realities of mountain life. But her heart, which had been dormant for so long after Robert's death, spoke louder now. Would you like that? She asked Lily. To stay here with Ethan? Lily nodded emphatically. He makes the nightmares go away. And he knows all about the plants. And he doesn't make me wear itchy collars like Grandmother Wilson did. Sarah laughed despite herself, grateful for the child's simple perspective. She looked to Thomas, whose opinion she valued as the older child, the one who might remember more of their previous life. What about you, Thomas? What do you think? The boy glanced between his mother and Ethan, his expression thoughtful. Pa would want us to be safe, he said finally, and happy. We're both here. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by her son's wisdom. She turned to Ethan, who waited with uncharacteristic vulnerability in his gaze. It won't be easy, he said softly. Mountain life is hard, even in the best of times. Life is hard everywhere, Sarah replied. At least here, we face it together. Ethan's expression lightened, hope replacing uncertainty in his eyes. Together, he repeated, the word both a question and a promise. Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't known she was carrying. Together. The first proper thaw came in mid-March, turning the snow around the cabin to slush and revealing patches of dark earth beneath. True. To his word, Ethan began preparations for expanding the garden and adding a room to the cabin. Each morning, he and Thomas would venture into the forest to select suitable trees, marking them for later harvesting once the ground firmed up enough for hauling logs. Sarah and Lily began preparing the garden soil, turning over the winter-hardened earth and adding composted material from the root cellar. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way that Sarah had never experienced during her years as a mine owner's daughter and then wife. Here, on this mountainside, her worth was measured not by her pedigree or her husband's position, but by the strength of her hands, the wisdom of her decisions, the depth of her care for those around her. She found herself thinking less and less of Pinecrest Valley, of the life they had left behind. One afternoon in early April, as Sarah was hanging freshly washed linens on a line strung between two pines, she spotted a figure on the trail leading up to the cabin, the first visitor they had seen since arriving months ago. Her heart raced with sudden alarm. She had grown so accustomed to their isolation that the sight of a stranger felt like an intrusion, a threat to the peace they had built. "Ethan!" she called, trying to keep her voice calm for the children's sake. He appeared from behind the cabin where he'd been splitting logs, instantly alert to the tension in her voice. Following her gaze, he spotted the approaching figure and moved to stand beside her, his hand resting reassuringly on the small of her back. "Do you recognize them?" Sarah asked quietly. Ethan squinted against the spring sunlight. "It's Jacob Miller, trapper from the North Ridge. Harmless, mostly." The qualifier did little to ease Sarah's concern. Mostly. Likes his whiskey when he can get it. Trades information and furs in Riversbend a few times a year. Ethan glanced down at her. "It's all right. He won't stay long." Jacob Miller proved to be a wizened man of indeterminate age, his face weathered by decades of mountain, winters into a maze of deep creases. He greeted Ethan with a grunt that apparently passed for friendliness among mountain men, then fixed curious eyes on Sarah and the children. "Didn't figure you for company, Blackwood," he remarked, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered with surprising politeness. "Times change," Ethan replied simply. Miller nodded as if this explained everything. Riversbend's buzzing about the widow and kids that went missing from Pinecrest last winter. Thought wolves got 'em. His shrewd eyes moved from Sarah to the children, who watched him with undisguised fascination. Guess they was wrong. Sarah's stomach tightened. "They're looking for us?" Miller shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Was, for a spell. Not so much. Now, Wilson's put it about that you'd run off with some drummer passing through. Folks believed it easy enough." The casual cruelty of the lie stung, though Sarah wasn't surprised. Of course the Wilsons would protect their reputation at the cost of hers. What did surprise her was how little it mattered now, how distant that life felt, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. "We're not going back," she said firmly. Miller raised bushy eyebrows at her tone. "Ain't my business either way. Just thought you'd want to know what's being said." He turned to Ethan. "Came to tell you there's a new sawmill opening in Riversbend. Fella running it is looking for good timber. Pays fair, I hear." The conversation turned to practical matters, of trade and news from the wider world. Sarah excused herself to check on the children, who had grown bored with the adult talk and returned to their chores. As she helped Lily sort seeds for planting, she found herself thinking about Miller's news. People in Riversbend thought they were dead, or worse. The community that had turned its back on them had already written their story, crafted an ending that absolved them of responsibility. Part of her burned with indignation, wanted to march into town and confront the lies. But a wiser part recognized the gift in this misunderstanding. Freedom from the past, from explanations, from judgments. Later, after Miller had departed with a bundle of Ethan's cured venison in exchange for salt and news, Sarah found Ethan standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the valley as the setting sun painted the distant peaks in shades of gold and pink. "Does it bother you?" he asked as she came to stand beside him. "What they're saying about you in town?" Sarah considered the question, testing her own feelings. "Less than I would have expected," she admitted. "It seems so unimportant now." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. The mountain has a way of changing perspective, makes the things that seemed vital feel small, and the things that seemed small become everything. "Like family," Sarah said softly. "Like home." "Yes." Ethan hesitated, then reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Sarah, I want to ask you something, but I'm not sure I have the right." The uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice made her turn to face him fully. "Ask," she encouraged. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with the direct gaze she had come to treasure. "I know it hasn't been long since, Robert. I know the proper time for mourning isn't past. But up here, time works differently, and He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I care for you, for the children, more than I thought possible after losing my own family." Sarah's heart quickened, hope and fear tangling in her chest. "I care for you too," she said softly. "I'm not asking for promises," Ethan continued. "Not yet, just permission to hope, to build towards something that might, in time, become more than friendship." The simplicity of the request, so like the man himself, honest, direct, without pretense, touched Sarah deeply. In the world she had left behind, courtship was a formal affair, governed by strict rules and expectations. Here, on this mountainside, with the valley spread below them like a promised land, those rules seemed as distant as the stars just beginning to appear in the evening sky. "Yes," she said, the word emerging as naturally as breathing. "I'd like that." Relief and joy transformed Ethan's face, erasing the last traces of the solitary guarded man who had found them in the abandoned ranger station months ago. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss that held both question and answer. When they returned to the cabin hand in hand, Thomas and Lily looked up from the checkerboard with knowing smiles that suggested they had been hoping for this development for quite some time. The four of them sat down to supper at the rough-hewn table, no longer strangers sharing space out of necessity, but a family bound by choice and growing affection. As spring gave way to summer, the garden flourished under their combined care. The new room took shape against the eastern wall of the cabin, its construction a family project that even Lily contributed to by handing up nails and smaller tools. Ethan taught Sarah and Thomas to fish in the clear mountain stream that ran below the ridge, while Lily proved to have a natural gift for identifying wildflowers with medicinal properties. One warm evening in late June, as fireflies danced in the twilight beyond the cabin's open door, Ethan presented Sarah with a simple ring fashioned from a gold nugget he had found years ago in the stream and kept for luck, he said. "I'm not asking you to forget Robert," he told her as he slipped the ring onto her finger, "just to make room in your heart for someone new." Sarah looked at the man before her, no longer the intimidating figure who had appeared in the ranger station doorway, but her partner, her friend, her future. "I already have," she said, and sealed the promise with a kiss. Behind them, Thomas and Lily exchanged triumphant glances, their world finally made whole again after the long winter of loss. The wedding was a simple affair, witnessed only by the children and Jacob Miller, who surprised them all by producing a dog-eared Bible from his pack and offering to read the service. "Was studying for the ministry before the mountains called me," he explained with a wink that made Sarah wonder about the stories behind this seemingly simple trapper. As summer faded into autumn and the mountains once again prepared for winter's embrace, Sarah stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Ethan and Thomas return from a hunting expedition with a deer slung between them. Lily worked beside her, carefully braiding herbs to hang from the rafters for the winter. The past year had brought changes she could never have imagined as she stood shivering on the Wilsons' porch, a sick child in her arms and despair in her heart. Hardship had led to refuge, refuge to healing, healing to love, and love to a new beginning none of them could have foreseen. As Ethan looked up and spotted her in the doorway, his face lighting with the smile that was now a familiar sight, Sarah felt a sense of rightness settle deep in her bones. This mountain had not been their destination, but it had become their destiny, a place of second chances, of family forged in adversity, of love that had bloomed in the most unlikely soil. They were no longer lost. They were home. 2 years passed, marking the rhythm of mountain seasons with their predictable unpredictability. The cabin that had once been Ethan's solitary refuge had transformed into a true home, filled with the sounds of family life that he had never expected to hear again. The garden had expanded twice over, now producing enough vegetables to last through winter with surplus to trade in Rivers Bend during their infrequent trips to town. Sarah stood at the edge of the garden, wiping soil from her hands as she surveyed the neat rows of corn, beans, and squash stretching toward the tree line. Her hair, once kept in a tight bun as befitted a respectable widow, now hung in a simple braid down her back, streaked with a few strands of silver that hadn't been there when they'd first arrived on the mountain. The sun had kissed her skin to a golden hue, and her hands, once soft from a life of relative comfort, were now calloused and strong from daily work. "Mama, look what I found!" Lily's voice carried across the clearing as she emerged from the forest path, her apron gathered up to form a makeshift basket. At 8 years old, she had grown tall and strong, all traces of the sickly child who had nearly perished in that first brutal winter gone. Her golden curls bounced as she ran, her face alight with excitement. Sarah smiled, setting aside her garden tools. "What treasure have you discovered this time?" Lily carefully opened her apron to reveal a bounty of wild strawberries, tiny and intensely red. "They're growing in that sunny patch by the big boulder. Ethan showed me where to look last year, but I found them all by myself this time." "These will make a wonderful treat," Sarah said, inspecting the berries with appropriate admiration. "Perhaps a special dessert for Thomas's birthday tomorrow." "Perhaps a special dessert for Thomas's birthday tomorrow?" The mention of her brother brought a conspiratorial gleam to Lily's eyes. "Ethan's teaching him something special. They wouldn't tell me what, but they've been down by the workshop." "All morning?" Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Thomas, now 11, had become Ethan's shadow, soaking up knowledge of mountain life like dry earth absorbs rain. The bond between them had grown so strong that sometimes Sarah forgot that Ethan wasn't Thomas's birth father, a thought that occasionally brought a pang of guilt, as if she was somehow betraying Robert's memory. But those moments had grown fewer as time passed. Robert would always hold a special place in her heart as her first love, as the father of her children. But life had moved forward in ways she could never have imagined that night they'd been cast out of Pinecrest Valley. And the happiness they'd found here on the mountain felt like a gift she had no right to refuse. "Let's get those berries washed and stored," Sarah suggested, guiding Lily toward the cabin. "Then you can help me prepare lunch to take down to our mysterious menfolk." The workshop stood a short distance from the cabin, a sturdy structure Ethan and Thomas had built the previous summer. Inside, the air smelled of freshly cut wood and leather oil, a scent Sarah had come to associate with the quiet contentment that now defined their lives. She found Ethan bent over the workbench, his broad shoulders hunched in concentration as he guided Thomas's hands on what appeared to be a small bow. The boy's face was a study in focused determination, his brow furrowed exactly like Ethan's as he carefully notched the wood. "Lunch for the craftsman," Sarah announced, setting the basket on a clear corner of the bench. Ethan straightened, his face relaxing into the smile that still made her heart skip. "Perfect timing. We were just finishing up." He rested a hand on Thomas's shoulder with obvious pride. "Show your mother what you've made." Thomas held up the bow with careful reverence. It was smaller than Ethan's hunting bow, perfectly sized for a boy on the cusp of adolescence. The wood had been polished to a warm glow, and delicate designs had been carved along its length. "I made it myself," Thomas said, his voice caught between childish excitement and the deeper tones of the young man he was becoming. "Ethan just showed me how. It's yew wood, the best for bows. And look," he reached for a leather quiver containing a half-dozen arrows. These too. It's beautiful craftsmanship, Sarah said sincerely, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Your father would be very proud of you. The words slipped out before she could catch them, and a moment of uncertainty flickered across Thomas's face. Which one? He asked quietly. Sarah glanced at Ethan, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though she could read the tension in his shoulders. It was a question that had been hovering unspoken between them, as the children had gradually begun referring to Ethan as Pa, or sometimes Father, titles he had accepted with humble gratitude. Both, she said finally, confident in the truth of it. Robert would be proud of the young man you're becoming, and Ethan is proud of you every day. Thomas seemed to consider this, then nodded with the solemn acceptance that often made him seem older than his years. I don't remember him very well anymore, he admitted. Just bits and pieces. Is that wrong? No, son, it's not wrong, Ethan said, his deep voice gentle. Memory works that way, especially for the young. But your mother keeps him alive in her stories and in her heart, and that means a part of him will always be with you. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by Ethan's generous spirit. This was what she loved most about him. His complete lack of jealousy toward Robert's memory, his understanding that love wasn't a finite resource to be hoarded, but an expanding circle that could encompass past and present. Now, Ethan continued, expertly shifting the mood, let's see if this bow shoots as true as it looks. After lunch, we'll set up some targets. Lily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, suddenly piped up. Will you make me one too when I'm bigger? Ethan chuckled, ruffling her curls. If that's what you want, though I suspect you might prefer the medicine pouch your mother's been planning for your next birthday. Lily's eyes widened. A real one? Like a proper healer? Sarah shot Ethan a mock glare. That was meant to be a surprise. Oops, he said, not looking remotely sorry. Must be getting careless in my old age. 39 is hardly ancient, Sarah retorted, beginning to unpack the lunch basket. Though your memory does seem conveniently selective at times. The easy banter flowed between them as they shared the simple meal of cornbread, dried venison, and early summer vegetables. Sarah watched her family, for that was truly what they were now, and marveled at how naturally they had come together, like scattered pieces of a puzzle finding their proper arrangement. After lunch, as promised, Ethan set up targets at various distances for Thomas to practice with his new bow. The boy's initial attempts went wide, but Ethan's patient instruction soon had him hitting the mark more often than not. Lily alternated between cheering her brother's successful shots and helping Sarah gather the last of the early summer herbs before they went to seed. As the afternoon waned, Sarah paused in her work, straightening to ease the ache in her lower back. The pain had been coming more frequently lately, a dull discomfort that she'd been careful to hide from Ethan, who tended to worry over her health with an intensity born of past loss. She watched as he demonstrated proper bow stance to Thomas, the sunlight gleaming on the silver streaks in his dark hair. Marriage and fatherhood had softened the hard edges that grief had carved into him, but she could still glimpse the solitary mountain man in the way he moved through the forest, in the quiet vigilance he maintained, even in moments of apparent relaxation. Riversbend had eventually learned that the missing widow and children from Pinecrest Valley had taken up residence with the reclusive doctor-turned-mountain man. The news had sparked curiosity and no small amount of gossip, but up here, miles from the nearest neighbor, such things seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. They had made a few visits to town over the past 2 years, primarily to trade Ethan's furs and Sarah's herbal remedies for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. The first trip had been tense, Sarah half expecting to encounter someone from Pinecrest who might challenge their right to the happiness they'd found. But Riversbend was a different sort of community, more open, less concerned with rigid propriety, home to many who had sought their own fresh starts in the mountain wilderness. A sharp pain interrupted Sarah's reverie, intense enough to make her gasp. She steadied herself against a nearby pine, waiting for it to pass. When it didn't subside after several moments, a flutter of alarm rose in her chest. "Ethan," she called, trying to keep her voice steady despite the increasing discomfort. Something in her tone must have alerted him, for he turned immediately, his expression shifting from relaxed to concerned in an instant. He crossed the clearing in long strides, reaching her side just as another wave of pain caused her knees to buckle. "Sarah." His strong arms supported her, his eyes searching her face. "What is it?" "I'm not sure," she admitted, her hand instinctively moving to her abdomen. A pain, sharp, not like normal aches. Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes. "How long have you been feeling this?" "Just now, so intense, but twinges for a few weeks." She saw the concern deepen in his expression and hastened to add, "I thought it was just from garden work, from bending too much." Ethan's medical training, dormant for so many years before their arrival, had gradually reawakened as he'd taught Sarah about herbs and healing. Now, his hands moved with professional efficiency, gently probing her abdomen, his expression focused. "Let's get you to the cabin," he said, his tone deliberately calm. "Thomas, help your sister gather the herb baskets." The children, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, hurried to comply without their usual stream of questions. Ethan lifted Sarah into his arms, despite her weak protests that she could walk, carrying her swiftly toward the cabin. Once inside, he settled her on their bed and sent Thomas for water from the spring. Lily hovered anxiously in the doorway until Ethan gave her the task of sorting the herbs they'd gathered, a job that would keep her occupied while allowing her to remain close by. "Tell me exactly what you're feeling," Ethan said as he helped Sarah into a more comfortable position. She described the pain, sharp, intermittent, concentrated in her lower abdomen, watching his face for clues to what might be happening. When another spasm hit, stronger than before, she couldn't suppress a moan. Ethan's hand found hers, offering strength as the pain peaked and gradually subsided. "Sarah," he said gently when she could focus on his words again, "I think you might be with child." The possibility struck her with the force of revelation, though in retrospect, the signs had been there. The missed monthly courses she'd attributed to hard work and lean mountain diet, the unusual fatigue, the sensitivity to certain smells. At 36, she had assumed her childbearing years were behind her, especially after so long without conception. "But the pain," she whispered. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Ethan's expression was grave, but not despairing. "The pain concerns me. It could be several things. Some serious, some not. We need to watch and wait." Thomas returned with the water, his young face taut with worry. Ethan thanked him and asked him to look after Lily, to keep her occupied outside within calling distance. The boy nodded, shouldering the responsibility with the maturity that continued to amaze Sarah. As the afternoon deepened into evening, the pain came and went in waves of increasing intensity. Ethan remained at Sarah's side, his medical knowledge warring visibly with his personal fear. He prepared herbal infusions to ease the pain and reduce bleeding if it came, his hands steady even as his eyes betrayed his concern. "I should have realized sooner," Sarah said during a respite between spasms. "I should have told you about the changes I was feeling." "Don't," Ethan said firmly. "This isn't anyone's fault. Bodies are complex, unpredictable." He smoothed damp hair from her forehead. "Just rest when you can. Save your strength." As darkness fell, Ethan lit lamps and built up the fire, creating a circle of warmth and light against the gathering night. He checked on the children, finding them huddled together on the bearskin rug. Thomas reading to Lily from one of Ethan's medical texts, an unusual choice that spoke volumes about their need for reassurance. "Your mother needs to rest," he told them gently. "She's going to be fine, but she needs quiet tonight. Can you both sleep in the loft?" They nodded solemnly, Lily's lower lip trembling as she asked, "Is Mama very sick?" "No, sweetheart," Ethan assured her, gathering the little girl into a hug. "She just needs to rest and let her body heal itself. Remember how we talked about how amazing bodies are at fixing themselves if we give them the right conditions?" This scientific approach seemed to comfort Lily, who nodded against his chest. "Like when Thomas cut his foot on the rock, and you said we just needed to keep it clean and give it time." "Exactly like that," Ethan agreed, though he knew the comparison was vastly oversimplified. "Now, why don't you both get ready for bed? I'll come up to say goodnight in a little while." Once the children were settled, Ethan returned to Sarah's bedside. The pain had intensified again, and with it came a new development. Blood, not a lot, but enough to confirm his fears. He worked with quiet efficiency, his doctor's training overriding his personal emotions as he monitored her condition. "Ethan!" Sarah gasped as a particularly sharp pain subsided. "If this is a miscarriage, we don't know that for certain," he interrupted, though his expression suggested otherwise. "If it is," she persisted, needing to speak the fear aloud, "will I still be able to have children after this?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. They had never explicitly discussed having children together. The family they'd formed with Thomas and Lily had seemed complete, a second chance neither had expected. But now, faced with the possibility of losing something they hadn't known they wanted, the desire for a child of their union crystallized with surprising intensity. Ethan took her hand, his expression softening despite the gravity of the situation. "Many women who miscarry go on to have healthy pregnancies, but Sarah, even if—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Even if that isn't possible for us, it doesn't change anything about how I feel, about our family." Tears welled in her eyes, not just from the physical pain, but from the overwhelming tenderness of this man who had rescued her in more ways than she could count. "I know," she whispered, "but I would have loved to give you a child." "You've already given me more than I ever dared hope for," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Now rest. Let your body do what it needs to do." The night stretched endlessly, marked by waves of pain and brief periods of exhausted sleep. Ethan remained vigilant, applying cool cloths to Sarah's forehead, helping her sip strengthening broths, monitoring the bleeding with professional detachment that couldn't quite mask his personal concern. Near dawn, the crisis peaked. The pain became almost unbearable, and Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out and waking the children. Ethan held her through it, his strong arms an anchor as her body worked to expel what could not be sustained. "I see something," he murmured, his voice clinical, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "It's happening now, Sarah. Try to breathe through it." She nodded, beyond words, focusing on his face as another contraction gripped her. There was a sudden release of pressure, a sensation of something passing, and then, remarkably, an easing of the pain that had dominated the last several hours. Ethan worked quickly, handling the small sack with gentle reverence. He didn't show it to her, understanding instinctively that such a sight might break her already fragile composure. "It's over," he said softly, returning to her side after disposing of the evidence of their brief hope. "The worst of it, at least. There will still be bleeding, some discomfort, but the acute danger has passed." Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her temples and into her hair, grief mingled with relief in a confusing tangle of emotion. Ethan's arms encircled her, and she turned her face into his chest, allowing herself to weep for the child they would never know. "I'm sorry," she whispered brokenly. "I'm so sorry." "No, love," Ethan murmured against her hair. "There's nothing to be sorry for. These things happen for reasons we may never understand. It's part of life, part of nature. Sad, yes, but not your fault. Never your fault." His medical knowledge provided the rational framework, but it was his own experience with profound loss that infused his words with genuine understanding. This shared grief, painful as it was, forged a new layer of connection between them, a deepening of the bond that had grown from unlikely beginnings into the cornerstone of their lives. Sarah drifted into exhausted sleep as the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin windows. Ethan remained beside her, watching the subtle changes in her face as she passed from wakefulness into dreams, grateful beyond measure that she, at least, would recover. The miscarriage marked a turning point in their mountain life. Sarah's physical recovery was relatively swift. Within weeks, she was able to resume most of her normal activities, though Ethan insisted she rest more frequently and leave the heavier tasks to him and Thomas. The emotional healing took longer, surfacing in unexpected moments of melancholy that would catch her unawares. Ethan understood these moments without explanation, offering silent support when words would have been inadequate. His own grief manifested differently, in a renewed dedication to teaching Thomas and Lily about the healing properties of plants, in the careful documentation of medical knowledge in journals that lined the cabin shelves, in the gentle persistence with which he encouraged Sarah to share her feelings rather than bury them. Summer faded into autumn, the mountain forests transforming into a riot of color that never failed to take Sarah's breath away. The garden yielded its final harvest, root vegetables and winter squash carefully stored in the root cellar beneath. The cabin. Thomas's skill with his birthday bow had improved dramatically, and he had begun to accompany Ethan on serious hunting expeditions, returning proud and exhausted with contributions to the family larder. Lily, following her own interests, had become a skilled herbalist under the combined tutelage of Sarah and Ethan. Her small hands were surprisingly deft at preparing tinctures and salves, and she approached the task with a seriousness that occasionally gave way to bursts of childish enthusiasm when a remedy proved particularly effective. One crisp October morning, as frost rimmed the garden beds and mist rose from the valley below, Ethan found Sarah standing at the edge of the clearing, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "Early for you to be up," he said, draping a warm shawl around her shoulders. "The children are still asleep." Sarah leaned into his solid presence, drawing comfort from his warmth. "I couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts." "Want to share them?" he asked. No pressure in the question, just an open invitation. She was quiet for a long moment, watching an eagle circle lazily over the valley. "I was thinking about Robert," she finally admitted. "About how life takes such unexpected turns. How the worst day of my life, being cast out with nowhere to go, led to finding you, to this home, this family." Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "And about the baby?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "That too. I keep wondering if it was a boy or a girl. If it would have had your eyes or my hair. If we'll ever have another chance. Do you want to try?" Ethan's voice was careful, neutral, giving her space to answer honestly. She turned to face him, searching his expression. "Do you?" A smile touched his lips, softening the lines that years of solitude had etched into his face. "Yes," he said simply. "I do, but only if you're ready, only if you want it too." "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Afraid of the pain, afraid of losing another, afraid of being disappointed." "All reasonable fears," Ethan acknowledged. "And I won't tell you they're unfounded. There are no guarantees in this life. You know that better than most. But fear isn't always a reason not to try." Sarah thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, of the desperate flight from Pinecrest Valley, of finding unexpected sanctuary in an abandoned ranger station. of the leap of faith required to follow a stranger to his mountain, home. If she had allowed fear to guide her then, where would they be now? "No," she agreed softly. "It isn't." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist to reveal the valley in all its autumn glory. Below them, life continued its eternal cycle, trees shedding leaves that would nourish next spring's growth, animals preparing for winter's dormancy, the endless flow of the river carving its patient path through rock and soil. "Whatever happens," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "we face it together. That's what family means." Family, such a simple word for such a complex reality. The family they had built wasn't the one either of them had envisioned in their youth. It was something unexpected, something forged in adversity and nurtured with love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. The sound of the cabin door opening drew their attention. Thomas and Lily emerged, still tousled from sleep, squinting against the bright morning light. "There you are," Thomas called. "We thought you might have gone hunting without us." "Without my best hunting partner," Ethan replied with mock incredulity. "Never." Lily skipped to Sarah's side, slipping a small hand into hers. "Can we have flapjacks for breakfast? It's cold enough for maple syrup." The normalcy of the question, the simple domestic pleasure it implied, filled Sarah with a profound sense of contentment. This was home, not the cabin itself, but these people, this love, this life they had built together out of the broken pieces of their separate pasts. "Flapjacks it is," she agreed, allowing Lily to tug her toward the cabin. "And I think we might even have some of those wild strawberries preserved from summer." As they gathered around the table for breakfast, steam rising from plates piled high with golden flapjacks, Sarah looked at each face in turn. Thomas, growing so tall and strong, his father's determination evident in the set of his jaw. Lily, vibrant and curious, her earlier frailty transformed into a resilient spirit. And Ethan, whose journey from isolated grief to embracing family mirrored her own path from desperation to hope. "I have an announcement," Ethan said as they finished the meal, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been corresponding with a doctor in Riversbend, Dr. Palmer. He's getting older, looking to train someone to take over his practice eventually." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, understanding immediately the significance of this revelation. "He's asked you to work with him?" Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "1 day a week to start. It would mean overnight trips to town occasionally. I told him I needed to discuss it with my family first." "You should do it," Thomas said immediately, pride evident in his voice. "You're the best doctor there ever was." "I'm rather out of practice," Ethan demurred, though his expression softened at the boy's confidence. "But that's part of why I'm considering it. Medical knowledge changes, advances. This would be a chance to update my skills, perhaps even help people beyond our little mountain community. We could come with you sometimes," Lily suggested eagerly. "I could learn more about medicines, and Mama could sell her herbal remedies in town." Sarah listened to the children's enthusiastic planning, touched by how naturally they incorporated this potential change into their vision of family life. The Ethan she had first met would never have considered returning to medical practice, too wounded by past failure and loss to risk caring for others again. That he was contemplating it now spoke volumes about the healing they had found together. "What do you think?" Ethan asked her quietly, once the children had cleared the breakfast dishes and gone outside to complete their morning chores. Sarah considered the question carefully. Life on the mountain had its challenges, but also a simplicity she had come to treasure. Regular trips to town would mean more interaction with the wider world, more curiosity about their unconventional family, perhaps even eventual encounters with people from Pinecrest Valley. But it would also mean Ethan reclaiming a vital part of himself, using his considerable skills to heal others as he had healed them. It would mean opportunities for the children to receive formal education alongside their practical mountain learning. It would mean growth, sometimes uncomfortable but necessary. "I think," she said slowly, "that the man I fell in love with was a healer long before he was a mountain man. And while I cherish our life here, I would never want to be the reason you denied that part of yourself." Relief and gratitude washed over Ethan's face. "You're certain it would change things?" "Life is change," Sarah replied, echoing wisdom he had shared with her many times. "We adapt, we grow, we move forward, together." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "Together," he agreed, the word both an echo and a promise. As winter settled once more over the mountain, bringing with it the peaceful isolation of heavy snow, life in the cabin took on a new rhythm. Ethan divided his time between their mountain home and his apprenticeship with Dr. Palmer in Rivers Bend, returning from each trip with medical supplies, books, and news from the wider world. The children thrived on this balance of isolation and connection, solidly rooted in their mountain life, but with branches extending toward new possibilities. Thomas began studying mathematics and science from textbooks Ethan brought home, his quick mind absorbing knowledge with the same focused determination he applied to hunting and survival skills. Lily divided her time between practical herbal knowledge learned at Sarah's side and the more formal botanical classifications found in Ethan's medical texts. And Sarah, watching her family flourish, found her own heart expanding to encompass both the life they had built and the future stretching before them, a future that, despite its uncertainties, felt rich with promise. Spring arrived early that year, the snow retreating up the mountainside in steady waves. New growth emerged from the thawing earth, tender shoots pushing towards sunlight with the same persistent hope that had carried them all through the darkest times. One morning, as she tended the first seedlings in the garden, Sarah paused, pressing a hand to her abdomen where an unmistakable flutter had made itself known. A smile spread across her face, private and wondering, as she acknowledged the new life growing within. A life created from love that had flourished in the most unlikely circumstances, proof that even the harshest winter eventually yields to spring. Later, she would share this joy with Ethan, watch his face transform with cautious hope. Later, they would tell the children, who would receive the news with excitement tempered by the wisdom of those who have already weathered loss. Later, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead with the strength they had forged together. But for now, in this quiet moment as morning sunlight gilded the mountain peaks and birds called from newly leafed branches, Sarah simply stood in her garden and gave thanks for the journey that had brought them here, for the family they had become, and for the resilience of the human heart, capable of finding love and purpose even in the wilderness of despair. The summer months passed, with gentle grace as Sarah's pregnancy progressed. Unlike her previous experience, this one seemed blessed with relative ease. The morning sickness that had plagued her early months giving way to a quiet energy that allowed her to maintain many of her daily responsibilities. Ethan watched her. With careful eyes, his medical training at constant war with his personal concern, but even he had to admit that both mother and unborn child appeared to be thriving. Thomas, now 12, had taken on additional responsibilities around the homestead with a seriousness that occasionally made Sarah's heart ache. He was still so young to shoulder such burdens, yet he did so without complaint, seeming to understand instinctively that his help was needed now more than ever. "You don't have to do everything, you know," she told him one afternoon as he struggled to carry a bucket of water from the spring that was nearly half his weight. "Ethan can manage when he returns from town." Thomas had straightened, a flash of his father's stubborn pride crossing his young face. "I'm not a little boy anymore, Ma. I can help. I want to." Sarah had recognized in that moment how much he had grown, not just in height, but in character. The frightened 8-year-old, who had trudged beside her through the snow, clinging to her skirts as they fled the only home he'd known, had transformed into a young man with a steadfast heart and capable hands. "I know you can," she had replied, touching his cheek gently. "I'm proud of you. Your father would be too, both of them." The comment had earned her one of Thomas's rare, full smiles, a lightening of the serious countenance he'd adopted since learning of the coming baby. That night, as she recorded the day's events in the journal Ethan had brought her from Riversbend, Sarah reflected on how fortunate they were in this second chance at family, not just her and Ethan, but the children too, who had found stability and love when all had seemed lost. Lily, at 9, had developed a special fascination with the baby, peppering Sarah and Ethan with endless questions about how babies grew and were born. Unlike Thomas, who approached the coming arrival with a mix of excitement and solemn responsibility, Lily saw only the wonder of it, the miracle of new life developing within her mother's expanding belly. "Will the baby have my yellow hair or Thomas's brown?" she asked one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Or maybe Ethan's black hair with the silver parts?" Sarah laughed, running a hand over Lily's golden curls. "We won't know until the baby arrives. That's part of the surprise. I hope it's a girl," Lily confided. "Boys are fine, but Thomas is always so serious now. A sister would be more fun." "The baby will be whoever they are meant to be," Sarah replied diplomatically, "and they'll be very lucky to have such a caring big sister to look after them." This prospect seemed to please Lily enormously, and she spent the following weeks preparing for her role as a caretaker with the same enthusiasm. She brought to learning about herbs and remedies. She insisted on helping Sarah sew tiny garments for the baby, her stitches irregular but determined, and collected the softest rabbit fur to line a cradle that Ethan and Thomas were constructing from pine harvested on their own land. Ethan continued his weekly journeys to Riversbend, his apprenticeship with Dr. Palmer evolving into a partnership as the older doctor recognized the depth of knowledge and natural healing instinct that Ethan possessed. The arrangement suited them both. Dr. Palmer gained assistance with his increasingly demanding practice, while Ethan was able to maintain his primary commitment to his mountain family. These trips to town also provided a welcome connection to the wider world. Ethan would return with not only medical supplies and necessities that couldn't be crafted or grown on the mountain, but also with books, newspapers, and occasional treats for the children. More importantly, he brought news and perspectives from beyond their isolated existence, ensuring that despite their remote location, they remained part of the larger human community. It was during one of these trips in late autumn, with the first dusting of snow already frosting the higher peaks, that Ethan returned with news that would once again alter the course of their lives. "The Wilsons are dead," he announced without preamble after the children had gone to bed, his expression unreadable as he sat across from Sarah at the kitchen table. Sarah's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending, a strange hollow feeling opening in her chest. Both of them? How? Influenza, according to Dr. Palmer. It swept through Pinecrest Valley last month. Many died, including George and Margaret Wilson. Ethan watched her face carefully, gauging her reaction. "There's more. Since Robert was their only child, and with no other heirs coming forward, the mine and property have been sitting abandoned. The town council is looking to settle the estate." "What does that have to do with us?" Sarah asked, though a part of her already knew the answer. "As Robert's widow and the mother of his children, you have a legal claim to the property. Dr. Palmer heard about it from a lawyer who travels between the mining towns. He asked if I knew the whereabouts of the widow Mitchell and her children who disappeared 3 years ago." Sarah set the mending aside, her mind whirling with implications. "What did you tell him?" "Only that I might be able to pass along the information to the interested parties." Ethan's expression softened. "It's your decision, Sarah. I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do with your husband's inheritance." The homestead in Pinecrest Valley, with its comfortable rooms and solid furniture, had once been the center of Sarah's world. The mine, though never her direct concern, had provided the security upon which their family life had been built. Now, these pieces of her past had unexpectedly circled back into her present, raising questions she had thought long settled. "I never wanted the mine," she said slowly. "I only wanted a safe home for my children. The Wilsons took that from us when they cast us out." "And now," Ethan prompted gently. Sarah placed a protective hand over her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "Now we have a home, a real one, built on love rather than obligation." She met Ethan's gaze directly. "But the mine has value. It could provide for Thomas and Lily's futures, education, opportunities we can't give them here on the mountain." Ethan nodded, understanding as always. "It doesn't have to be one or the other, Sarah. We could maintain our life here while ensuring the children benefit from what is rightfully theirs." "You would be willing to manage such complications?" Sarah asked, a hint of wonder in her voice. "Even after all this time, to have one foot in the world we've built and another in the one we left behind?" A smile touched Ethan's lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes in the way that still made her heart skip. "I would face far greater complications to secure your happiness and the children's future. But in this case, I think the solution might be simpler than it appears." Over the following weeks, as winter settled in earnest around their mountain home, Sarah and Ethan discussed the unexpected inheritance and how best to approach it. Letters were exchanged with the lawyer in Pinecrest Valley, establishing Sarah's identity and claim. As the snow deepened, making travel increasingly difficult, the matter was temporarily set aside to be resolved when spring made the journey possible. Sarah found herself grateful for this enforced delay. The thought of returning to Pinecrest Valley, of facing the ghosts of her past and the community that had turned its back when she needed them most, filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. There was some satisfaction in the knowledge that she would return not as a desperate widow, but as a woman who had not merely survived, but thrived against all odds. Yet there was also anxiety about how this re-entry into her former world might affect the children, who had few memories of their life before the mountain. December arrived with a particularly fierce storm that isolated them completely for nearly a week. As the wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, Sarah felt the first unmistakable contractions begin, mild at first, then gradually intensifying as the day progressed. "The baby's coming," she told Ethan calmly as he returned from checking the livestock in the small barn they had constructed the previous spring. "Earlier than we expected, but definitely on the way." Ethan's expression shifted from surprise to focused determination, the doctor in him taking precedence over the anxious father-to-be. With efficient movements, he began preparing the cabin, heating, water, gathering clean linens, arranging their bed for the delivery, while Sarah paced slowly around the main room, pausing to breathe through each contraction. Thomas and Lily watched these preparations with wide eyes, their expressions a mixture of excitement and fear. Sarah smiled at them reassuringly during a pause between contractions. "Everything is going to be fine," she promised. "Babies come when they're ready, and it seems this little one is eager to meet you both." "Can we help?" Thomas asked, his young face solemn with responsibility. "Indeed you can," Ethan replied, including them in the process rather than shutting them out. Thomas, I need you to keep the fire burning hot and steady. Lily, you can arrange the baby clothes we've prepared and keep an eye on the kettle of water. Both jobs are very important. Giving the children specific tasks eased their anxiety, channeling it into productive action rather than helpless observation. As the afternoon deepened into evening, Sarah's labor progressed steadily, her body remembering the ancient rhythms of childbirth despite the years since she had last experienced them. Unlike the frightening, painful process that had marked her miscarriage, this labor, though intense, felt natural and purposeful. Ethan remained by her side throughout, his medical knowledge providing practical support while his love offered emotional strength. When the pain became nearly overwhelming, she found herself grateful for his dual perspective. He understood both the physical process and the personal significance in ways few others could have. As midnight approached, with snow still swirling, outside the cabin windows and the children finally asleep in the loft after hours of anxious waiting, Sarah felt the unmistakable urge to push. Ethan positioned himself to assist, his expression focused yet luminous with anticipation. "You're doing beautifully," he encouraged as she bore down with each contraction. "The head is crowning. One more push should do it." Gathering her remaining strength, Sarah pushed with all her might, feeling the extraordinary sensation of the baby slipping from her body into Ethan's waiting hands. A moment of breathless silence was broken by a strong, indignant cry, the sound of new life announcing its arrival with healthy lungs. "A girl," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion as he laid the squalling infant on Sarah's chest. "A perfect, beautiful girl." Sarah gazed down at the tiny face, still red and wrinkled from birth, wisps of dark hair plastered to her damp head. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears of joy streaking her cheeks. "We've been waiting for you." As Ethan tended to the practical necessities that followed birth, Sarah marveled at the immediate, overwhelming love that flooded her heart. This feeling was familiar. She had experienced it with Thomas and Lily, yet somehow new, as if each child created their own unique space in a parent's heart. "What shall we name her?" Ethan asked as he settled beside them on the bed, his finger caught in the surprisingly strong grip of his newborn daughter. Sarah considered the question, studying the baby's features, Ethan's dark coloring already evident, but perhaps her own nose and chin, a new life born from past sorrows, a bridge between what had been lost and what had been found. Hope, she decided. Her name is Hope. The name seemed to settle around the infant like a blessing. Perfect, in its simplicity and meaning. Ethan nodded, a smile transforming his face with joy that erased the last shadows of the solitary man he had once been. "Hope Blackwood," he murmured, testing the sound of it, "a good name for a mountain child?" In the morning, Thomas and Lily crept down from the loft, their faces alight with wonder as they met their new sister. Lily was particularly enchanted, reaching out with gentle fingers to touch the baby's downy head. "She's so small," she marveled. "Was I ever this tiny?" "Even smaller," Sarah told her with a smile. "You were born early, remember? But look how strong you've grown." Thomas hung back slightly, watching the baby with a thoughtful expression. "She looks like Ethan," he observed finally. "But maybe a little like you too, Ma." "And that makes her perfectly herself," Ethan said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Just as you are perfectly yourself, with pieces of your father in your face and your mother in your spirit." This acknowledgement of Thomas's dual heritage, the father he had lost and the father he had found, seemed to ease something in the boy's expression. He moved closer then, allowing himself to be drawn into the circle of family that had expanded to include this new, precious life. The days following Hope's birth took on a dreamlike quality, the outside world held at bay by winter's embrace while the family adjusted to its newest member. Ethan postponed his trips to Riversbend, sending word via a passing trapper that Dr. Palmer would need to manage without him until the trails cleared. His place was here, helping Sarah recover her strength while learning the rhythms of a daughter's needs. Hope proved to be a remarkably content baby, crying only when hungry or uncomfortable, otherwise regarding the world from her cradle with solemn dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. Lily appointed herself assistant caretaker, singing improvised lullabies and reporting the smallest details of the baby's day with earnest excitement. "She smiled at me," she announced importantly one morning, though Ethan gently explained that newborns didn't truly smile socially for several weeks. "But she knows you're her sister," he added, seeing Lily's disappointment. "She knows your voice and feels safe with you. That's why she's so calm when you're near." This explanation satisfied Lily, who redoubled her efforts to be the most attentive big sister possible. Thomas, too, found his own way of connecting with the baby, crafting a small wooden mobile to hang above her cradle, the carefully carved figures of mountain animals spinning gently in the warmth rising from the fire. January melted into February, and February into March, the harshest part of winter gradually releasing its grip on the mountain. Hope grew steadily, her newborn fragility giving way to chubby limbs and increasingly alert responses. Sarah regained her strength, resuming many of her usual tasks while adapting to the new rhythms imposed by the baby's needs. As spring approached, the question of Pinecrest Valley and the Wilson inheritance re-emerged in their discussions. The lawyer had sent additional correspondence, conveyed by Dr. Palmer through Ethan, once the trails were passable enough for his weekly journeys to resume. Decisions would need to be made soon if they wished to secure the children's claim. "We should go," Sarah said one evening as they sat before the fire, Hope sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. Thomas and Lily deserved to benefit from what would have been their father's legacy, and I need to face that place again, to truly put the past to rest. Ethan studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination that had first drawn him to her, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive when others might have surrendered to despair. "Then we'll go together, as a family. Once the passes are fully clear." The decision made, they began preparations for the journey. It would be Hope's first trip away from the mountain, and Sarah found herself both anxious and oddly excited to introduce her youngest child to the wider world. They would travel first to Riversbend, where Ethan would introduce Sarah to Dr. Palmer and the contacts who had been assisting with the legal matters. From there, they would continue to Pinecrest Valley to address the inheritance directly. April arrived with its characteristic unpredictability. Warm, sunlit days, followed by brief, fierce snowstorms that delayed their departure. Finally, in late April, with the mountain trails mostly clear and Hope a sturdy 3.5 months old, they set out for Riversbend. The journey was easier than Sarah had anticipated. Thomas rode his own mount now, a steady mountain pony Ethan had traded for the previous autumn. Lily shared Sarah's horse, while Ethan carried Hope securely against his chest in a sling, adapted from designs he'd observed among native families during his early years in the mountains. Their small caravan made steady progress down the mountain trails, camping one night under clear stars before reaching Riversbend the following afternoon. The town had grown since Sarah's last visit. New buildings stretching along the main street and more activity evident in the dusty thoroughfare. They drew curious glances as they rode in, not just because they were an unusual family group traveling with an infant, but because many of the townspeople recognized Ethan and were clearly intrigued by this glimpse into the private life of the reclusive mountain doctor who visited only weekly. Dr. Palmer welcomed them warmly to his comfortable home behind the medical office, his wife fussing over the children with grandmotherly affection, while Ethan introduced Sarah with obvious
pride.
The older doctor's kind eyes missed nothing, taking in the healthy appearance of all three children and the quiet contentment that surrounded the family despite the challenges of their unusual living situation. "You've done well for yourself, Blackwood," he remarked as they sat in his study that evening, discussing the business that had brought them to town. "Better than I expected when you first came down from that mountain of yours, looking like you'd rather face a grizzly than treat another patient." Ethan acknowledged this with a rueful smile. "I was in a dark place then. It took extraordinary circumstances to draw me back to life." His gaze moved to Sarah, who was settling Hope for the night in the adjacent bedroom. "Extraordinary people." Dr. Palmer followed his gaze, nodding thoughtfully. "The best medicine often comes in unexpected forms. Now, about this business in Pinecrest." He shuffled through papers on his desk. "I've arranged for you to meet with Mr. Harrison, the lawyer handling the Wilson estate. He'll be in Riversbend tomorrow, specifically to speak with you both." The meeting the following day was cordial but complex. Mr. Harrison, a precise man, with spectacles perched on his thin nose, laid out the legal situation in careful detail. The Wilson estate was substantial, not just the homestead where Sarah and Robert had lived, but also mining interests that had continued to produce income even after the Wilsons' deaths. As Robert Mitchell's widow, and on behalf of his minor children, "You have a clear claim to a significant portion of the estate," the lawyer explained. "The Wilsons died intestate, that is, without a will, which simplifies matters in some ways and complicates them in others." Sarah listened attentively, aware of Ethan's supportive presence beside her. "What exactly would this mean for my children? Thomas and Lily are Robert's by birth, but Hope—" She hesitated, glancing at her youngest daughter sleeping peacefully in Ethan's arms. "The inheritance would legally belong to the children of Robert Mitchell," Mr. Harrison confirmed. "However, as their guardian, you would manage these assets until they come of age. How you choose to utilize them for the benefit of your entire family is largely at your discretion." The conversation continued, exploring options and legal requirements. By the end of the meeting, a plan had taken shape. Sarah would travel to Pinecrest Valley with Mr. Harrison to formally claim the inheritance on behalf of Thomas and Lily. The mining interests would be professionally managed, with the income set aside in trust for the children's future education and needs. The homestead itself could be sold or rented, depending on what Sarah deemed best. "You don't have to decide everything immediately," Mr. Harrison assured her. "The important step is establishing your claim before other distant relations might." "Come forward," Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. The inheritance presented an opportunity to secure advantages for the children that mountain life alone could not provide. Formal education, perhaps even university for Thomas, who showed a particular aptitude for mathematics and science. Yet, she had no desire to return permanently to the society that had once rejected her, nor to disrupt the life they had built together on the mountain. That evening, as the children slept in Dr. Palmer's guest rooms, Sarah and Ethan discussed the day's developments on the doctor's back porch, the spring air mild around them, and the stars bright overhead. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noting her contemplative expression. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, considering her answer. "I'm thinking about how strangely life unfolds. 3 years ago, I was desperate and alone, cast out from that house with nowhere to turn. Now, I'm being offered the chance to reclaim it, not as a supplicant, but as the rightful heir. Does that bring you satisfaction?" Ethan's question was gentle, free of judgment. "Some," Sarah admitted, "but not in the way I might once have imagined. When the Wilsons first cast us out, I was consumed with anger, with the injustice of it all. I fantasized about returning triumphant someday, making them regret their cruelty." She shook her head, smiling ruefully. Now that the opportunity has actually arrived, I find I care less about vindicating myself and more about simply securing what rightfully belongs to the children. Ethan nodded, understanding as always. The best revenge is living well, they say, though I suspect you've moved beyond thoughts of revenge altogether. I have, Sarah agreed, reaching for his hand. What would be the point? The Wilsons are gone. The community that turned its back on us has suffered its own tragedies, with the influenza. And we, she glanced through the window to where their children slept peacefully. We found something better than anything I left behind. The journey to Pinecrest Valley 2 days later was a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to the place where Sarah's life had been torn apart and subsequently set on an entirely new path. She traveled with Mr. Harrison, leaving Ethan and the children in Rivers Bend, where Hope's needs could be more easily met, and Thomas and Lily could be spared the potentially difficult emotional experience. As the stagecoach crested the final hill and Pinecrest Valley came into view, Sarah felt a strange disconnect. The town was simultaneously exactly as she remembered and utterly changed. New buildings stood alongside familiar ones, and the mine operations appeared to have expanded. Yet there was also evidence of the recent tragedy that had swept through the community. A new section of the cemetery visible on the outskirts, several businesses shuttered. The coach deposited them outside the town's only hotel, where Mr. Harrison had arranged rooms. "We'll visit the county clerk first thing in the morning," he advised as they parted for the evening. "Then the mine office, and finally the homestead itself, if you wish to see it." Sarah nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the day's journey. In her simple room, she sat by the window, looking out over the town that had once been her entire world. Lanterns were being lit along the main street as dusk fell, small pools of light pushing back against the gathering darkness. How different. Her perspective was now viewing this place not as the center of existence, but as merely one point in a much larger landscape. The Sarah who had lived here had been defined primarily by her relationship to others, daughter, wife, mother. The Sarah who returned was all of those things still, but also more: survivor, builder, healer, partner. The mountain had taught. Her self-reliance had stripped away social conventions to reveal the core strength she hadn't known she possessed. She thought of Ethan and the children waiting in Rivers Bend, imagined Hope's solemn dark eyes taking in new surroundings, Lily's excited chatter as she explored Dr. Palmer's garden, Thomas's quiet observations of town life so different from their mountain home. They were her true north now, her center of gravity. This place, for all its painful history and unexpected legacy, was just a location on a map. The next morning unfolded as Mr. Harrison had outlined. The county clerk, a new appointment since Sarah's time in Pinecrest, was formally polite as they filed the necessary paperwork. The mine office presented more complex negotiations, with the current manager clearly surprised by the appearance of Robert Mitchell's widow after years of absence. "We'd heard you were no longer in the area," he said carefully, avoiding direct mention of the rumors that had been spread about her disappearance. "I found a new home," Sarah replied simply, offering no further explanation. Mr. Harrison smoothly redirected the conversation to business matters, establishing Sarah's authority to make decisions regarding the mine operations on her children's behalf. By mid-afternoon, these official tasks completed, they stood before the Wilson homestead. The house appeared well-maintained externally, though there was an emptiness about it that suggested its uninhabited status. Sarah hesitated at the gate, memories washing over her, bringing Thomas home as a newborn, Robert lifting Lily onto his shoulders as they walked up this very path, the final confrontation with Margaret Wilson that had ended with the door slamming in her face. "Would you prefer to wait here?" Mr. Harrison asked, noting her hesitation. "I can check the property's condition myself." Sarah shook her head, squaring her shoulders. No. I need to see it to finish this chapter properly. Sarah pushed open the gate, its familiar creak stirring memories she had long tucked away. The path to the front door was lined with the same rose bushes Margaret Wilson had tended with such pride, now overgrown but still blooming defiantly in the spring sunshine. Each step felt like walking through time, the ghost of her former self moving alongside her, younger, more naive, unaware of both the hardships and the joys that awaited beyond these walls. Mr. Harrison produced a key, but Sarah paused before allowing him to unlock the door. "This was my home once," she said quietly. "But standing here now, I realize it never truly belonged to me. It was always the Wilsons' house, where Robert and I were merely permitted to dwell." The lawyer nodded sympathetically, waiting for her to continue or signal her readiness to enter. After a deep breath, Sarah nodded, and he turned the key in the lock. Inside, the house was exactly as she remembered, yet fundamentally changed by the absence of its former occupants. Sheets draped the furniture, creating ghostly silhouettes. In the dimness, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that penetrated the partially closed drapes. The silence held an expectant quality, as if the house itself waited to learn its fate. Sarah moved through the rooms slowly, Mr. Harrison respectfully following at a distance. The parlor where she had sat with Robert during their courtship. The dining room where uncomfortable family meals had been endured under Margaret's critical eye. The kitchen where she had learned, inadequately by her mother-in-law's standards, to manage a proper household. Upstairs, she hesitated longest outside the bedroom that had been Thomas and Lily's. The small beds remained, stripped of linens, but otherwise untouched. A forgotten wooden soldier lay on the windowsill, evidence of the hasty departure forced upon them. Sarah picked it up, running her fingers over its smooth surface, one of Robert's creations, carved during the long evenings before illness had claimed him. "I'll take this, if nothing else," she said, slipping the toy into her pocket. "Thomas might remember it." The master bedroom, once belonging to George and Margaret, held no emotional significance for her. But the smaller bedroom where she and Robert had lived through their brief marriage was another matter. Here, her children had been born. Here, Robert had drawn his final breath, his hand clasped in hers as fever ravaged his body. Here, she had wept alone in the dark days that followed, before the Wilsons' tolerance had expired and she had been cast into the wilderness. Standing in that room now, Sarah was surprised to find the sharp edges of those memories had dulled. The pain remained, but transformed, a quiet ache rather than the searing wound it had once been. Time had not erased her past, but it had integrated it into the larger tapestry of her life, each thread necessary to create the whole. "I've seen enough," she told Mr. Harrison, turning away from the room that had witnessed both her greatest joys and deepest sorrows. "The house should be sold. It holds more value as capital for the children's future than as a monument to the past." They descended the stairs and stepped back into the spring sunshine, the door closing with a decisive click behind them. As they walked away from the house, Sarah felt a weight lifting, not dramatically but gradually, like mist burning away under the morning sun. She had faced her past and found herself stronger than its shadows. The return journey to Riversbend the following day felt lighter somehow, the stagecoach carrying her forward into a future that now included both the mountain sanctuary they had built and the legacy they had reclaimed. Mr. Harrison would remain in Pinecrest Valley to handle the sale of the house and the ongoing management of the mine interests, sending regular reports and disbursements for the Children's Trust. When the stagecoach arrived in Riversbend, Sarah spotted Ethan immediately, standing tall among the waiting crowd, with hope secured against his chest. Beside him, Lily bounced with poorly contained excitement, while Thomas maintained a more dignified posture, though his eyes scanned eagerly for her appearance. The reunion was joyful, the children speaking over each other to share the adventures they'd had in town during her absence, the sweets Dr. Palmer's wife had given them, the bookstore. Thomas had discovered the medicinal garden Lily had helped tend. Ethan said little, but his eyes conveyed everything: relief at her return, questions about her journey, love that needed no verbal expression. That evening, after the children were asleep in their room at the small hotel where they would stay, one more night before beginning the journey home, Sarah and Ethan finally had time to talk privately. "How was it?" he asked simply, going back. Sarah considered the question, wanting to give him the most honest answer she could. "Strange, like visiting a place I dreamed about rather than actually lived in. Everything was familiar, yet nothing felt like it belonged to me anymore." She smiled, taking his hand. "My life is elsewhere now." Ethan nodded, understanding as always. "And the business matters?" "Settled as well as they can be for now. The house will be sold, the mine shares managed professionally. Thomas and Lily will have educational opportunities we couldn't otherwise provide, and security for their futures." She hesitated, then added, "I made sure the arrangements include provision for Hope as well, though legally the inheritance belongs to Robert's children. I hope that doesn't—" "Of course it doesn't," Ethan interrupted gently. "They're siblings, family. These distinctions that matter to lawyers mean nothing in the reality of their relationships." Relief washed over her, though she had never truly doubted Ethan's generosity of spirit. The legal complexities of the situation had raised questions that needed explicit answers. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her pocket for the wooden soldier she had taken from the house. "I found this in the children's old room. Do you think Thomas would want it? Or would it only stir up painful memories?" Ethan examined the toy thoughtfully. "Memory isn't something to be feared, Sarah. It's part of who we are, the good and the bad together. I think Thomas should have the chance to decide for himself what meaning this holds for him." The journey back to their mountain home took 2 days, the family traveling at a leisurely pace to accommodate Hope's needs and to allow the older children to explore the changing landscape as they gained elevation. With each mile, Sarah felt herself settling back into the rhythms and perspectives that had become her truth over the past 3 years. The cabin welcomed them with the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke, everything exactly as they had left, it yet somehow renewed by their temporary absence. Thomas and Lily ran to check on their special places, the fort Thomas had built near the stream, the herb garden Lily tended with such care. Ethan carried their supplies inside while Sarah walked. The perimeter of their clearing, Hope cradled against her shoulder, reacquainting herself with the home they had created together. That evening, as they gathered around the table for the first meal in their own home since their return, Sarah presented Thomas with the wooden soldier. The boy took it carefully, his expression solemn as he turned the toy in his hands. "Your father made this for you," Sarah said gently, "before he became ill." Thomas nodded, memories visibly moving behind his eyes. "I remember," he said finally. "He used to make them at night when he thought I was sleeping. He said every boy needed an army to command." Lily leaned over, examining the toy with interest. "Did he make things for me too?" "A little wooden horse," Thomas replied before Sarah could answer. "With a yellow mane, like your hair. You used to carry it everywhere." The simple exchange opened a door that had been closed for years. Throughout the meal, memories of Robert emerged naturally in the conversation. Thomas recalling fishing, trips to the stream near Pinecrest, Lily asking questions about the father she barely remembered, Sarah sharing stories of their courtship and early marriage. Ethan participated easily, without jealousy or discomfort, sometimes asking questions that helped the children connect their past to their present. His security in his place within their family allowed him to honor Robert's memory rather than feeling threatened by it. Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah found Ethan on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky above their mountain home. She joined him, leaning against his solid warmth in the cool night air. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For making space for all of who we are, past and present. For never asking me or the children to forget what came before." Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "The past shapes us, but it doesn't define us. What matters is the life we choose to build from its lessons." They stood in comfortable silence, the night sounds of the mountain, a familiar lullaby around them. Sarah thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperation to security, from grief to joy, from isolation to family. None of it had been easy. All of it had been worth it. "What happens now?" she asked, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to hear his vision of their future. "Now," Ethan smiled, the expression visible even in the dim starlight. "Now we continue. We raise our children. We tend our garden. We heal those we can. We love each other through whatever comes next." The simplicity of this answer contained all the wisdom they had gathered through their shared experiences. Life offered no guarantees beyond the present moment, no promises except those they made to each other. But standing there beneath the vast mountain sky, surrounded by the home they had built together, Sarah knew it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.